And good evening, everybody. I'm assuming that when Mark asked everybody to put themselves on mute, he was making an exception for me. Otherwise, it would have got a little bit difficult. And I'm flattered that people are tuning in to listen to this tonight. I'm missing Coronation Street and Ronnie O'Sullivan playing the Masters snooker tonight. So, as I say, I am flattered. Tonight's talk is about three of my main interests, really. The first one is the English language. I'm not an expert on the English language by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not an etymologist, but I do like the quirkiness of the English language. I've always liked puns and plays on words. The second interest is painting and art. I've dabbled in this ever since I was a kid and still engage in it now. And both of those things I got involved in through my teaching career. I taught English and art at the start of my career in a comprehensive school. The third interest, of course, which has been the backdrop to my whole life, really, has been natural history. So combining those three things is what this talk is about. I should have said, actually, that the advert on the North Wales Wildlife Trust website had an image of a singing bird. So if you thought that this talk was going to be about birdsong and the noises and language that animals themselves make, that's not what this is about at all. It's about our language for those creatures. So if you were mistaken and you've come here by mistake to listen to this, I thought I'd give you something else to think about. The last time I did a talk, I think for the Conwy branch, I gave them this little puzzle to do. The puzzle was, can you think of a sentence with the word "and" 5 consecutive times, and it had to make sense? And the answer, some of you may remember, was somebody putting up a sign for a pub, and they were told that when they'd finished it, there was too much space between the word fox and goose. So tonight's puzzle is in similar veins, and it's got a language theme, of course. So if you get bored during the course of the next hour or so, have a little think about this. Can you think of a sentence where the word "because" appears 3 consecutive times in a sentence that makes sense? But moving on, my interest in natural history and language to an extent was first cultivated when I was just 2 years old, in fact, and collected this P.G. Tips card of a nuthatch, which was part of Tunnicliffe, that great artist, part of his P.G. Tips set, Bird Portraits. I've mentioned this before, but I always think about not just that particular card, but the whole P.G. Tips cards when I was a kid has really helped me to develop my enthusiasm. But when I was at primary school, I remember this book. I don't know if anybody else does. The New First Aid in English. And I specifically remember a task that was set in that book by Angus MacIver about collective nouns. One of the ones I always remember is a leap of leopards. So I was introduced to collective nouns at an early stage. And then I got the first opportunity to put those three things together professionally, if you like, when I was a teacher, and I was asked by Encyclopedia Britannica to produce a number of worksheets of different topics to encourage kids to use children's Britannica, which was in most schools across the country. This is before the national curriculum, but it was underused. So they asked me to produce these worksheets, and I don't know if you can see down here, but some of these sheets that were deliberately designed to look like the teacher's own work, so they were hand done. They had bold reference points that the kids had to go and then look up in the encyclopedias. But that was quite successful for me at an early stage of my teaching career. And then a real labour of love, I was asked to produce a set of commemorative cards for Brook Bond, and each one of the cards of this set in 1994 represented one of the sets that I'd loved throughout my childhood. So I say a real labour of love, and so many of those cards were to do with natural history, of course. So I did that for Brook Bond in 1994. And then I produced a set of cards for a company called Images and Editions. And these were plays on words, puns, which, as I said before, I've always loved. And I'll let you make your own judgment on some of these. So that was the first one. It was a set of 18 cards. Your poultry in motion. Happy birthday to my old man. You're the girl for me. I can't hear you all giggling, but that's probably because you're on mute, but no doubt you're rolling about the armchairs looking at these. I love you for heifer and heifer, and congratulations. So that was a nice opportunity for me, as I said, to combine all these three interests of mine. I would love to have written a book called The Etymology of Entomology, but I never did. Instead, my first book that I wrote and illustrated was A Dissimulation of Birds, and it was the illustrated book of collective nouns for birds. It was published and marketed through the RSPB catalogue at the time, and the RSPB asked me to do a follow-up, a sequel, and that was a menagerie of animals, so the collective nouns of animals, and it included reptiles and insects as well. And then they were later combined into a single volume, and this is the one that's on sale now if anyone wants to get it. A bit of a plug, A Murmuration of Starlings. So that's what this first part of the talk is going to be about, essentially, the different collective nouns. And lots of them have a very interesting history. They go back to medieval times, most of them, and many of them originated by the hunting and shooting fraternity. And so this is the cover of one of the earliest books. It was called L'Art de Venerie, or The Art of Hunting. Venerie means hunting, and it was written or dictated by William de Twicy, who was the huntsman for King Edward II. So this was 1328. We don't know if he was literate enough to write it himself, but he would certainly have dictated it, and this included many of the collective nouns that are still in use today. Next to have them printed was the Egerton manuscript in 1452, followed shortly afterwards by probably the most famous book in terms of the history of these collective nouns, the Book of St. Albans. And this is unusual in that it was written by a woman, the prioress, Dame Juliana Berners. The subtitle was The Book of Hawking, Hunting, and the Blasting of Arms. That sounds good, doesn't it? And a section in it, a chapter in it, was The Companies of Beasties and Fowlies. And again, the collective nouns. Some of you will know about this book, which was turned into a film. I think it was sometime in the late 60s. And I'm mentioning this because it relates to the medieval protocol and the hierarchy in falconry, which was far more popular in those days than it is today. But there was a clear hierarchy of which birds went for which class of people. So eagles, for example, were for emperors. Gyrfalcons for kings, merlins were for ladies, the yeomen had goshawks, and the lowly knaves, the lowest of the classes, were kestrels. And I mention that because there was a similar rigor in the language that we use within those hunting fraternities. So it was expected that you use the correct collective nouns for these different animals and birds, particularly where they're related to the hunting fraternity. And as we go through some of them, you'll see that there are quite a number of, for falconry, for example, for hounds, there was a different one for a group of 2 or 3 or more. And I said the protocols were fairly strict and you would be expected to know. Sounds like I was there at the time, doesn't it? But I've read about this. That's how I know these things. But the derivation of lots of these nouns is quite different, and they evolved in different ways. So this is an interesting one. This quantity of smelts first appeared in a book that some of you again will know, Isaac Walton's famous Complete Angler, first published in the 17th century in 1653. And it tells of Isaac Walton standing on the banks of the River Thames, looking down and seeing quantity of smelts swimming upstream to breed. They're a member of the salmon family, and they swim upstream as members of the salmon and trout family do in order to breed. And he just simply said a quantity of smelts was seen. Subsequently, in all the lists of collective nouns, this was taken as a specific collective noun for smelts. Now, it's interesting because these days, if you go on the internet, you'll see all sorts of invented collective nouns. One of the recent ones that never appeared in lists that I looked at when I was writing this book, but now seems to have become fairly commonplace, is a loveliness of ladybirds. And a loveliness of ladybirds seems to have been certainly a 20th, if not a 21st century invention. And the purist in me thinks, oh, you know, that you can't just include these things that people have just invented. And yet back in the 17th century, that's exactly how that happened, and these things did evolve. So one of the quandaries I had when I was choosing which ones went in my books was about integrity. You know, how did you validate whether something was a legitimate noun or one that was just fanciful, just been invented? And I don't think probably that there's any definite answer to that. But the traditional ones are in a number of different categories. So some of the traditional collective nouns relate to the sounds or the calls that people make. And the most obvious one that I think lots of people use and is still in common parlance, murmuration of starlings. And this relates to anyone who's stood by a flock, even a small flock of starlings, especially at this time of year when they congregate together, just in a tree, and you'll hear the chattering, the murmuration that they make. And that's where the noun comes from. 2 years ago in Anglesey on Paris Mountain, this spectacular murmuration took place. And you'll have seen similar things like this on the television, but it was wonderful to witness this in real life. There's a similar one at the moment at CUDDY on Anglesey, 500,000 birds just before dusk, especially on still nights. They are indeed going round and round, and a wonderful sight to see. And in that particular group, there's probably about 250,000 birds, believe it or not.
They're coming, yeah.
And if you haven't ever seen one, I can certainly recommend, you know, finding out where they are. They sometimes do move around at winter. They'll move from one place to another, simply because 500,000 droppings every night begins to really smell. And so they choose different sites after a few weeks, but well worth going to see. Here's one that you might not expect, particularly when we're talking about a category of sounds, a smuck of jellyfish. This isn't the sound that the jellyfish themselves make, but if ever you've found a stranded one on a beach and tried to move it with your foot, and it go to, you know, that smacking sound, the slurping sound that it makes, this is where the collective noun comes from. And it's quite a legitimate collective noun, been around for a long, long time. And once again on Anglesey in the middle of November, there were a lot of these things washed up. They're not technically jellyfish, but we think of them as jellyfish, Portuguese man-of-war. And on the west coast of Anglesey, after the November gales, there were lots of these washed up. This is a photograph by one of our young birders, Louis Burgess. I don't know if Louis is with us tonight, but that's one of his photographs. And there were lots of these on the west coast just a few weeks ago. Quite spectacular things to see, and they're normally much further out at sea. Charm of finches, again, a collected noun that's still in fairly common usage, and it relates, people use it particularly with goldfinches, but it relates to all finches. I'm fortunate enough to have a really healthy population of greenfinch in my garden, which I'm told by Jeff Gibbs is not common at all for Anglesey, but I have up to 40 of them coming to my feeder. I think in places in recent years they've been a declining species because of their disease, but nice to see them. A mews of hounds sounds like it's not a sound, you know, we use the word mews to mean silent, don't we? But the derivation of this is from the Old French, mews meaning a pack or a kennel. And there's a lot of different collective nouns for different hounds, different groups of hounds. So 3 hounds together is called a leash. And bloodhounds have their own specific collective noun called a suit. Another category, I won't include all collective nouns tonight, of course, there isn't time to do them all, but I'm picking out ones of particular interest. And another category is the progeny of young, and kinder is one you may have heard of, a kinder or a kindle of kittens. Cats themselves have different ones, a clowder, is an alternative collective noun for cats. And of course, the big cats have their own. A pride of lions is very common. And one I mentioned from my primary school textbook, the leap of leopards. A nigh of pheasants is French again. A lot of French influence on some of these old medieval words. Nigh is French for nest. So a nest of pheasants. You'll often see pheasants in gregarious groups, of course, but particularly when they've been bred these days. And I get dozens of these things in my garden, unfortunately, coming around the base of the bird table. And of course, what we sometimes forget, as well as these 50 million birds that are released into the wild every year, we also have those birds that haven't been shot that are still breeding. So hopefully there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and some of you, I'm sure, will know that DEFRA has said that they're going to license pheasant release this year in England. To be honest, I'm not quite sure whether Wales has said the same thing, but the Wild Justice group, headed by Chris Packham, has pushed this issue, and they're due to be licensed this year in England, which of course is music to our ears, I'm sure. Habits or characteristics of creatures, another category, and a fairly common one that people are aware of, labour of moles, a creature that we don't often see, but this particular individual is dead, but this was just sitting on the ground in one of our wildlife walks at Marford Quarry a few years ago. And even though it was dead, it hadn't been dead long, it was just interesting to see a real mole, because I say the opportunity to do that is so rare, isn't it? But interesting creatures, a labour of moles. Sedge of Bittern's is also an interesting collective noun because it's thought to be a mistake. So in the days before the printing press, which of course they're the days that we've just been talking about, medieval times, the scribes had to handwrite all of these things, and when books were copied, they had to copy them, and this is thought to be a miscopying of an alternative collective noun, both for bitterns now and for herons, and that's a siege. So a siege makes far more sense, although sedge relates to the habitat that these two birds would be found in. A siege is more likely as a collective noun, we think, and relates to the stalking, silent, waiting for the prey that is the methodology of these birds. And certainly at this time of year, a little note there to just remind people that the collective noun is not a heronry, which is often used as a collective noun. The heronry is the group of nests where the herons breed. In other words, it's the place, not the collective noun for herons. This is a photograph at Dean. I think there were 7 herons in this particular group. You often see them outside of the breeding season in gregarious groups like this, particularly in winter, and especially if they find a rich food source. Just a few hundred yards from my home here in Anglesey over the winter, there's been 4 or 5 herons, but along with half a dozen great white egrets and 4 little egrets in a patch of the river, the Avon Allow, River Allow, near where I live. So there's obviously been food there of one sort or another, and certainly those great white egrets are going to be like the little egrets, we think. They're becoming more and more common. This is just an interesting picture that I thought people might like to see. Heron, this particular one, I think its eyes were bigger than its stomach. It had its eye on this big carp, but the big carp managed to scare the heron away. Obviously too big an item of prey for that one. Fall of woodcock is a lovely collective noun, I think. Woodcock are nocturnal for much of the day. Much of the night, I should say. They're crepuscular as well. In other words, they fly at dawn and dusk. And that means that you often come across and find woodcock in places that you wouldn't have seen them on the night or the evening before. In other words, there's been a fall of woodcock in the same way as there might have been a fall of snow, which I just think is really evocative, really nice. I once upon a time came across a woodcock that did look as if it just dropped out of the sky. It was found dead in my school grounds, and you can see by how young I am looking there that it was a long, long time ago, but it was nice to actually have one close up to paint, in fact. And then we've got a group of collective nouns that we call true collectives, and these are often ones that are still in common usage that we apply to more than one creature, sometimes to a number of different creatures. And so the first one of these is a trip of hares. And when I was living in a village, Clyde, just outside Wrexham, there was a hare that came in front of my window almost every morning on the gravel path. Quite relaxed he was, and he just sat there having a bit of a nibble. And again, a creature that you don't often see close up very often. More gregarious and more likely to see a group of them and use the collective noun in March, of course, or around the time that they're mating in the spring. That they tend to be far more solitary at other times. And then a herd of curlew, which perhaps, once again, seems an inappropriate collective noun. You do often see curlews together. When you see one by itself, the collective noun clearly isn't appropriate, but of course you often see them feeding in fields. And perhaps some of the people don't necessarily know is that at one time they were a fairly common Sunday roast. And so a herd of curlew has a particular resonance there with the food source, as well as the fact that they're feeding in a field, much like you might see a herd of cows. Pack is a true collective noun applied to different things. A pack of stoats would more likely be a family group, I think, than just a group of multiple stoats together. And again, I was quite fortunate. I was sitting on a farmer's gate looking out on a field for a grasshopper warbler a couple of years ago, when this little chap came along and seemed to be as interested in me as I was in it. Just a delightful moment. Because I had the camera out looking for the grasshopper warbler, I was able to get a nice photograph of it, but eventually, of course, it jumped away. For those people that don't know, the difference between a stoat and a weasel is the blacktail, but they're totally different from weasels, which are weaselly identified, really. Party, another true collective. This one for jays here. Band of jays is also an alternative collective, and an underrated bird, still regarded by some as a pest, but one of our most colourful birds. They're beautiful. Other true collectives: company, a flock. And here's an interesting creature that you might not associate with that collective noun, a flock of lice. So if you find yourself a bit itchy in bed tonight, it may be that there's a flock of lice nearby. A troop, often used in relation to monkeys, troop of monkeys, still quite commonly used. A band, which we just mentioned in relation to jays. And a swarm. Now we think of perhaps a swarm of locusts, a swarm of bees, but the other creature that it's applied to very specifically is eels. So next time you see what you might call a shoal of eels, the proper term is a swarm of eels. Now this is another interesting one because of a miscopying. So a bale of turtles doesn't seem to make any sense at all. The given explanation is the collective noun for doves is duel. And that derives, again, from the Old French, mourning, and that connection is because of the mourning, cooing sound that doves make. So a duel of doves is thought to have been miscopied by some poor scribe, probably in the 15th century. So they not only miscopied duel as bale, but they miscopied turtle dove as turtle. So turtle doves turned into a bale of turtles. If you've got a better explanation, then do let me know. A grist of bees is perhaps another unusual one. And because bees are associated with people, it's one of those creatures that we've had a long association with because of the hives. There are lots and lots of different collective nouns for bees. Of course, not all bees. These collective nouns are associated with the honeybee. And this photograph was taken at a time when a beekeeper had found a swarm in a tree and was moving it in a cardboard box. But of course, we have lots of solitary bees. Mark and Jill will know a lot about this one. The red mason bee is a solitary bee, as are the andrena bees or the mining bees, which are solitary, and so the collective noun wouldn't apply to them. Wisp of snipe is still a collective noun that is used from time to time within the shooting fraternity. And it's a nice word. A walk of snipe is an alternative. Dead birds would be either a couple or a leash for 2 or 3. And it is the hunting and shooting fraternity that have kept alive quite a lot of these collective nouns that otherwise would have fallen into complete disuse, as some indeed have. You often see lots of snipe together. On the ground, they're very difficult to see, of course, easier in flight. These photographs were taken at Venus Pools in Shropshire. One of my favourite collective nouns, this painting, incidentally, I gave to John Harrop, who some of you will know from the Wildlife Trust, because he just loves pine martins and already had a collection of pine martin paintings. So I gave him this one, not to be confused with martins, and it sometimes is, house martins. People will sometimes mistake the two, but the richesse of martins comes from the extremely rich fur that martins have, and one of the reasons why they were often killed for the fur related to the sable, the mustelid. And I was fortunate enough at one time in the dim and distant past to have a house up in the Ardnamurchan Peninsula. And as many of the houses up there do, where it's locally common and was some time ago, used to come to the bird table to take jam sandwiches and eggs, and was diurnal as well. It would come at times during the day. The egg is there, and interestingly, they would never ever eat the egg in situ. Jam sandwiches, they'd sit there and munch them, but pine martins would always take the egg away, and try as I might, I could never find out where they took it to eat. This is a misunderstood collective noun, a set of badgers, because, as you might imagine, it's mistaken for the set SET, which is the home. This is quite different, and it comes from the Old French, once again, meaning city. Set is the French word for city. So the collective noun is a city of badgers. And of course, badgers, very gregarious, very communal. So the collective noun is often very appropriate. But don't mistake set for set. Again, I used to have them in my garden in Rosses. I haven't got photographs of a group of them, but this one used to come to my garden on a regular basis where we fed it. And that's the set in the field behind my garden there, where they used to live and come out. Cast hawks, falconry related, of course, and the cast specifically relates to just a pair, and there's an alternative to that, as you might expect, a couple of hawks, a leash for 3. A leash is also the specific collective noun for merlin. Goshawks have a specific one, that's flight. And eagles, a convocation, which sometimes is quoted in various things, various texts. This was a sparrowhawk that came to my garden fence on one occasion, caught a goldfinch, and it was about 15 minutes trying to actually swallow the rest of the gold. I think that must be the femur, the leg of the goldfinch, which it actually couldn't swallow, taking on a bit more than it could chew. It's always good for a laugh, this one, especially if you've got kids. This is a knob of waterfowl, again, a quite legitimate, well-recorded, ancient collective noun, but it relates to a group of waterfowl, and it can be any sort of waterfowl, with fewer than 30 birds. If there are more than 30, there are a variety of collective nouns you could use: a bunch, a sword, trip, plump, suit, company, flight. And what will even more likely to get a bit of a grin is that if there are fewer than 20 birds, would you believe it's called a little knob? Tee-hee-hee. Cloud of grasshoppers, the collective noun cloud is utilised for a number of different insects, grasshoppers and butterflies. You don't often see clouds of butterflies these days, but one of the places you can, as members of the Conwy branch I'm sure will know, silver-studded blues on the Great Orme, where you can get up to 1,000 of them flying on a single day. So it's a great place to go and see a cloud of butterflies. Now, this is just for I'm looking at the clock here. This is just a note to me to remember the time and just to clock watch to make sure I don't go on for too long, but also perhaps for you. So if you did misunderstand this talk and you thought this will be worth listening to, but in fact you're finding it a bit irrelevant, then you've only got another half an hour or so to go. Unkindness of Ravens is a collected noun that became particularly popular recently. It was the title of a book, wasn't it? I'm trying to remember the author, Ruth Rendell, I think it was, who wrote a thriller called Unkindness of Ravens. So it went into the common parlance. And again, the Great Orme is a good place to see groups of ravens. But the best, of course, is Newborough Warren in Anglesey at this time of year, where the biggest raven roost in Western Europe, I understand, still exists. It used to be much bigger a few years ago. I think it was up to about 2,000 birds. And if I'm right, at the moment, it's sort of between 600 and 700 birds. So it's still very big, but not as big as it used to be. But a good place to see an unkindness of ravens. It derived from the mistaken belief, by the way, that the adult birds would neglect the young in the nest. And it's a theory that people don't quite understand how it derived, but the books will tell you that that's the derivation of the unkindness phrase. Now, descent of woodpeckers also seems a little inappropriate. Green woodpeckers do tend to come down to the ground, but again, green woodpeckers would likely only be seen in a family group. Different families of woodpeckers don't really associate together. And the other woodpeckers, that's a juvenile green woodpecker. It's a lousy photograph. I used to see dozens of green woodpeckers in Norfolk. I used to live near to a heath where there were lots of them, and they would land on telegraph poles, but I never photographed them at the time. But this is a young great spotted woodpecker, so they do sometimes come down. I've often seen great spotteds come into the grass like this to clean their bills, as well as to forage perhaps for food, but they don't often come down. This is the nearest I got to photographing two together reasonably close to the ground at the bird table. That's a male because of the red nape and the youngster with the red cap. Parliament of owls is a nice collected noun. Again, lots of people will have heard, but not many of the owl species will be gregarious and grouped together. Tawny owls don't really. So if you see a group of tawny owls, likely to be a family group. But I thought people might be interested in this. This is again when I was living in Cley, and one evening a tawny came down and before it got dark, and took a young rabbit from right outside my window. And I didn't have the camera. But the very next morning, early in the morning, would you believe, the tawny owl came down again and took a rabbit which was on the path here. You might recognize this was the path that I photographed the hare on from my window. And this tawny owl came down, took a rabbit. It was so heavy that it couldn't actually fly all the way off with it initially. Magpies were interested in it. It was mantling the prey. And then eventually it flew off with the rabbit. Now, what surprised me was that I understood that tawnies only swallowed their prey whole. And what this shows is, because that's far too big for a tawny to swallow, what that shows is that sometimes at least tawny owls do indeed pluck and eat their prey. But I was delighted to have caught that on camera. But from behind my house, I was also lucky enough, there was an oak tree there with nesting little owls, which are territorial, but you'd only see a group of them in family groups, such as this. Whereas short-eared owls, rather, you often see a lot of them together. So Aberfrau on the southwest coast of Anglesey, a good site in the winter months where these owls migrate to us in the winter from Scandinavia. So you see lots of them together where there's good hunting. But the best owls to see a parliament would be long-eared owls, because they roost together again in the winter months. In Norfolk, I was fortunate to see a group of 3 together. I didn't get a photograph. I wasn't photographing birds when I was down there, but I did do a painting of them. There's a funny story attached to this, because I was shown this group of long-eared owls by a keen bird watcher who lived in my village. He was a policeman. He showed me these. We went away. The next day I went back to look at them again, and as I approached, I could hear this murmuring, and there must have been half of Norfolk Constabulary all sitting there watching, all in uniform, by the way, all watching these long-eared owls. So any of the criminals that knew that that was going to take place, they would have had a field day, I think. Anyway, enough of collective nouns. You've probably had enough of them, so we're going to move on now to a few words about folk names. And this is the book that I wrote, Pick, Cheese, Billywise and Cobble, or in other words, Blue Tit, Barn Owl and Red-Throated Diver. There are hundreds and hundreds of these names, but once again, just a few that I thought I'd mention here for interest tonight, just to give you a flavour of some of the variety that you can find across the country. Very few of these are now in common parlance. They're all localised, of course, often associated with local dialects. And in this age of telecommunications, you know, the local dialects themselves, let alone the specific words, are disappearing, aren't they? So you're unlikely to hear many of these now. But for the barn owl, Billywise was thought to be an onomatopoeia, in other words, relates to one of the many sounds that barn owls make, as indeed is Rora. Barn owls gave rise to lots of the ghost stories, because they often nested in belfries and church towers, and of course at night they can emit quite a loud piercing scream, and the people who didn't know a lot about barn owls associated that with the graveyards nearby. Woolet is a corruption of owlet from Shropshire, and Jenny Howlet is a sort of a familiar phrase that derives from owlet, which was common in Yorkshire at one time. Nightjar, which of course comes from night churr because of that churring noise that they make. Mothhawk is a fairly widespread folk name for it, related of course to its prey, as is shown in the illustration there. Fern owl, habitat related. Ferns often grow in some of the habitat, particularly edges of woodlands, edges of habitat, heathlands where they frequent. And goatsucker, of course, is a global word. There's a family of birds known as the goatsuckers, the nightjars. And this is mythology related. As the name suggests, at one time, people were convinced, partly because of its big wide gape and the fact that it was seen at night, and around livestock. Now, livestock, as it was moving about, would disturb the insects on which the nightjars fed, so they were often seen around livestock. So this myth evolved, whereby they were said to actually suckle the sheep, particularly sheep and goats, and that's where the name comes from. Interesting stuff, isn't it? House sparrow, the word sparrow comes from Anglo-Saxon spewa, and lum linny is a Scottish phrase that nobody seems quite to know where it's derived from, but the Scottish certainly have used the phrase lum linny to describe the humble house sparrow. And cuddy is one of those familiar phrases, a bit like Jenny Owlet, like a term of endearment. Interestingly, the word cuddy can also be used in Northumberland for the wren or the tree creeper. And grey spadger is a corruption particularly common in Ireland. They don't use the grey bit, but spadger was certainly a common word for the sparrow when I was growing up in Liverpool. Little Grebe's alternative name, I'm sure people know this, dabchick. And dab comes from dop, which is to dive. So a dopchick is one of its folk names. Black chin, fairly self-explanatory from its appearance. That's a Berkshire expression. Drink a penny, another one that we don't quite understand how that's derived, but it's a Scottish term. And Tom Pudding, it's just got that sort of rotund, puddingy sort of feel about it, I suppose, hasn't it? A term of familiarity which derives in Cheshire. Blue tit, a tit itself is anything small, really, short for titmouse. And other birds, apart from the family that we know today as titmice or tits, were called tits historically. Don't forget, you know, not that long ago in terms of our evolution, people didn't have field guides, didn't know the names of all of these things. There were no optical equipment. We didn't have binoculars or telescopes. And I think we sometimes forget that. Sometimes I hear people bemoaning the Victorian or Edwardian tendency to shoot things. But of course, they shot things very often for research, genuine scientific research, because they weren't able to see them close up in the way in which we can today with all of our technology. Pick cheese, onomatopoeic, again to do with its sound, but potentially also because of its habit of picking perhaps literally at cheeses. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, blue tits were renowned for pecking at milk bottle tops to get at the cream when people used to have their milk bottles delivered on the front doorstep. And so it may relate to that habit as well. And it's a Norfolk expression. Blue oxeye isn't perhaps as daft as it initially sounds. An oxeye is another term for a bullseye, and a bullseye simply means something small or diminutive. So it's a small bird. So blue oxeye comes from there, and it's a Scottish term. And billy biter, if you've ever watched blue tits at the nest, if anything approaches, you know, they can be quite aggressive, fierce little things. And so in Shropshire, that was how they derived that folk name, the billy biter. Nuthatch is fairly self-explanatory to do with the way nuts are hatched or got at by the nuthatch with its jabbing beak. Mudstopper, people will know that they stop up the hole with clay or mud around the entrance to minimize that for predators getting in. So that's a habit that gives the name mudstopper, and it's a southern English expression. Job in relates to the jabbing beak. Job is to stab. That's a Midland, Northamptonshire expression. And blue woodpecker, fairly self-explanatory. Great spotted woodpecker. Most of these names relate to the fact that they're black and white. Magpie isle from Gloucestershire simply means they're like a magpie, isle meaning light, magpie isle. Pied woodpecker, black and white, of course. And French pie, French really in the sense that it's alien at the time that the term came into being. Lots of things that were alien were caused French. You know, we were at war with the French for a lot of our history. So an alien pie, in other words, the black and white one, to distinguish it from the green woodpecker, which when our British Isles were far more wooded, the green woodpecker was far more common than it is today. Interestingly, just the word woodpecker is used as a folk name for the nuthatch in Surrey and the tree creeper in Ireland. Stone chat, the noise, if you've ever listened to a stone chat, the way you remember it, it's said to resemble pebbles or stones being tapped together. So that's where the common name comes from. And the mortetta is a corruption of moor tit. Moors, of course, and heaths being their habitat. That's from Yorkshire. And gorse is another name for gorsejack is the bird in the habitat of gorse. Furze, I should have said, is another name for gorse. So that's where furze hacker comes from. Puffin, they can't really find a definitive answer of where puffin came from. Its Latin name, is to do with its black and white friar-like appearance, and actually means little friar, because friars used to wear black and white habits. But the actual puffin, it might be to do with its puffed up appearance as a suggestion, but it's not definitive. C. parus, fairly obvious, that's a Norfolk term, but clearly to do with its beak and its parus appearance. Mullet, another one, it's a word that's used for the puffin in Scarborough and on the northeast coast, but nobody quite knows where that got from. I don't think it's its hairstyle, although possibly could be. And is it a fish reference? There's obviously a red mullet, there's a grey mullet, there's different sorts of fish, but an uncertain one. But certainly, we know that it is a term that was used in that part of the world. And then a parrot-billed willie, another one from Norfolk specifically relating to its appearance. Avocet is quite a nice derivative. It comes from the Italian avocetta. Avis is Latin for bird. Etta is the Italian diminutive name for charm and grace. So avocetta. The cobbler's awl obviously relates to the unique bill that the avocet has, which looks like the awl, the big needle, if you like, that the cobblers will use for making shoes, and yarwhelp is to do with the sound that it makes. Butter flip, possibly a tool used in butter making, so again to do with its appearance. But lots of these terms, as I'm probably making clear, they're not definitive. We don't exactly know how they originated, and because so many of them in the dim and distant past, difficult to find out. Red-breasted merganser, mergus is to dive, Latin to dive, answer goose, so that's where the word itself comes from. Spear widgeon, fairly self-explanatory, it's to do with its bill, and it doesn't look a great deal unlike a European widgeon, but that's a term that originates in Sussex. And then sandbill, a corruption of sawbill, along with the goosander and the smew. Red-breasted mergansers are the family of sawbills. And herald duck is so called because haveld is the Icelandic term for duck, and the Shetland being quite close to Iceland, the folk name herald duck, because it often frequents sea locations. Red-throated diver, a lovely bird. Obviously, its name is fairly self-explanatory. There's lots and lots of ancient, particularly Norse, legends to do with divers, not just the red-throated, but all divers, although they didn't identify the great northern as a separate species until relatively recently. But lots of mythology surrounding them, one of which is that it does herald bad weather, rain and storms. So rain goose. And then cobble, who knows, another one that we can't find out much about. Silver grebe is very much to do with its winter plumage. This is a Kentish Southern English term, and of course in England the only time you would ever see these birds is during winter, when they migrate further south. So when you see them in winter, they don't have their red throat, and they're very silvery in appearance. Rain goose reminds me of a joke that my dad used to tell me about a mongoose and a guy who wanted to keep them. So he wrote to the zoo and he said, please send me 2 mongoose. He thought, that doesn't sound right. He said, please send me 2 mongooses. He said, no, that doesn't sound right either. Please send me 2 mongoose. In the end, he crossed it all out. He said, please send me a mongoose. P.S. Please send me another one. So moving on to idioms now. You may think that was a cock and bull story, but I'm going to take the bull by the horns and now talk about animal idioms. Now, this is a book I'm actually in the process of doing. I've done about 25 of the 40-odd paintings at the moment, and I'm going to show you the paintings initially. And so if you're sitting at home there, you can perhaps have a little guess and think if you can work out what the idiom is before I tell you what it is. Some of them are very obvious, like the cock and bull story. Others might be a little more obscure. The book I'm hoping is going to be called A Box of Frogs, and you may think that I'm as mad as a box of frogs for doing so. But I expect it to be published either at the end of this year or the beginning of next. What is an idiom? There are two definitions of it. So one is a style of expression in speech, music, or writing that could be to do with time or people. So, for example, Chaucer's English had a very different idiom to our modern usage of English. Similarly, when I was down in Norfolk, they had a very specific idiom in their speech to that which you might hear up in Scotland. The second definition is the one that I'm concerned with, and that's a group of words whose usage is, in its meaning that we understand, is different from the literal meaning. So if I said to you, you know, spill the beans, you would know exactly what I meant, but you wouldn't literally go and throw some beans everywhere in the same way as you wouldn't go and pull your leg, but you'd know what I meant if I said pull the other leg. So here's the first one, and I'm sure you will get that, and there are two options here. So of course, it's bear with a sore head or bear with a sore paw. The meaning is to be irritable or grumpy or angry. The next one, again, fairly obvious, so I'm sure you've all got that one. And there it is to have a bee in your bonnet. And the meaning of that, to go on and on about something that you're concerned about, but perhaps nobody else is. You've got that one, I'm sure. Bats in the belfry, which basically means that you're mad. And a very common one, often used, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. It means one thing for certain beats having something that might be better, but there's no definite about it, nothing definite about it, it's uncertain. Incidentally, so far I have collected, it's really surprised me, I've collected about 1,500 different animal idioms, about 50 of which are extremely rude. And I have to talk to my publishers about whether they get included or not. I'm sure you got this one. Big fish in a small pond. One who's important only within a small circle of people. And I'm sure you've got this one, and Mark's probably even identified all the butterflies, although a couple of those butterflies aren't the easiest, but I'm hoping that they've been depicted accurately. And of course, butterflies in the stomach, what I had, of course, before I did this talk, the feeling nervous anticipation. Crocodile tears is another obvious one, I would think. False or insincere tears or grief. There's lots of photographs online of crocodile tears in real life with butterflies drinking from them. I mean, you might argue with the term tears, but certainly not just crocodiles and alligators, but other reptiles as well, seem to have quite a lot of fluid around their eyes, and these butterflies come down and drink. There are some photographs on the internet with dozens of butterflies around the eyes of these creatures. So this is a double one. So you've got to think of two idioms for this one. And again, both of them perhaps not too difficult. I've obviously illustrated the easy ones as I'm starting off. I'm building up to the more difficult ones. Dog in a manger, which of course is somebody who stops others from using things that they have no use for themselves. And then to let sleeping dogs lie. Leave things alone so that they don't get worse. Not always the best policy. And if you don't get this one, then you must have fallen asleep. The elephant in the room. Obvious issue or problem which nobody seems prepared to mentio. That should be to mention, of course. Now here's an interesting one. A round robin. What is a round robin? Well, it's a tournament in which each competitor plays against every other competitor in turn. What I found interesting is that I didn't know this until I started researching the book. It has absolutely nothing at all to do with our garden bird. It comes from, would you believe, it comes from the French. Ruban rond means round ribbon, and it originated as a nautical syndrome where on boats, if the sailors had a petition that they had to sign because for whatever reason they've been ill-treated or whatever, they wanted to send that petition but without identifying who'd instigated it. So instead of writing it line by line, they would sign a petition like the spokes of a wheel, or in a ruban rond, as it was called. So the round robin relates to the way in which petitions used to be signed to avoid identifying the instigator. So that's just I found that quite interesting. Another idiom, perhaps not immediately obvious, but you may have guessed, eyes like a hawk, or hawk-eyed, obviously meaning excellent eyesight. If you don't get that one, I'm surprised. Put the cart before the horse, do things in the wrong order. And this one is, I'm going to go a little bit quicker now. I'm looking at the clock, coming up to the hour, I think. So this one, lounge lizard, and a lounge lizard is a layabout, basically, who habitually gets himself invited to parties and out to social gatherings. I use the word he. Obviously, it could be female as well. And moths to a flame, the way someone is strongly attracted to something. Packed like sardines, squashed tightly together, open a can of worms, do something which will become problematical or complicated. Monkey on your back. It was pointed out to me by somebody that in fact is a Barbary ape. To which I responded, ah yes, but did you know that a Barbary ape is in fact a type of monkey? It's not an ape at all. So it was quite legitimate. And in researching monkeys, I found out something else interesting, because I thought, and just hear me out here, people, to freeze the balls off a brass monkey sounds terribly crude, doesn't it? But I'm happy to relate it to you, because in fact it isn't. It seems that a brass monkey was a tray that used to be on ships to hold the cannonballs for the cannon. So the lads who used to put the powder in the cannon were called the powder monkeys, and the tray for the cannonballs was called a brass monkey. And if there was freezing weather, especially overnight, the tray and the balls would freeze. So to freeze the balls off a brass monkey has actually nothing to do with what all of you thought it was. It's quite legitimate, not at all rude, and relates to a nautical term for cannonballs. This is one that I thought was quite obvious, really, but a few people who've looked at it since sort of struggled with it. But it's simply stag night, which is a bachelor party. This one fairly straightforward, probably. Snake in the grass. Somebody deceitful, particularly someone who pretends to be your friend, but then they do the dirty on you later on. Cat amongst the pigeons, of course. And again, in researching that and some of these others, there's an interesting cat idiom, which is to let the cat out of the bag. And the image that I've always had in my mind is literally a cat coming out of a bag, but it relates, again, a nautical term, the cat o' nine tails, which was a whip called a cat because it left marks on somebody's back like scratches of a cat. And if one of the sailors snitched on one of their mates and got them into trouble, they effectively let the cat out the bag because the whip was kept in a red sack. And so by letting the cat out the bag, it meant that their friend was going to be whipped. So quite interesting. We know some of these phrases, but don't always know where they come from. Knee high to a grasshopper simply means very small or very young. Again, one that not everybody that I've shown it to has got, but to turn turtle is to turn upside down, often used in relation to overturned boats on the lake or sea. And this one, again, not everybody has got, but you need to know what the bird is, which is pretty much to scale. They're big, big birds, and it's an albatross. And to have an albatross around your neck is to carry a heavy burden or a wearisome problem. So that's it on the nouns and the folk names and the idioms. But just going back to your little puzzle, in case you wanted to know what the answer was, then it's simply that you shouldn't start a sentence with because is a conjunction. But you all knew that, and I think that is pretty much just on the hour, as we said it would be, Mark.